What's up, guys? Welcome back to MMA Meeting. Let's talk with the Weasel podcast, where we'll talk all things MMA. So we just got done with that fight night card, and the next one's going to be the pay-per-view. But did Sean Strickland surprise anybody? He fought a bit differently, huh? He was actually going for it, being very aggressive, trying to get the knockout. It actually hurt Nassourdine in the first round. He dipped with that right hand and hit Nassourdine on the forehead and stunned him a little bit. I was actually kind of surprised from that, but remember that Strickland was bigger. He was heavier than Nassourdine going into the fight, and he's going to carry a bit more weight. As much people say that he's pillow hands, remember that he's still a pretty big guy. Anybody that size can hurt you with the right shot. But I'm not gonna lie, Strickland is much better, or should I say he's much more technical when he's just sticking behind the jab like he used to do. When he was winging out right hands like that, they're all haymakers and big wild punches. It didn't look that clean, but it was pretty effective. And Nassourdine had a hard time hitting him clean, even in those wild brawls. So that fight was a clear example as to how much Strickland's heavy sparring has benefited him in this game, where he can go right into this fight on short notice and still have great reactions to punches like that. And it's exactly like I was talking about in my prediction video. This is one of those fights that I did get almost completely correct on the prediction. Nassourdine did not really change much. He wasn't as active, and he needed to be more active than Sean Strickland in order to win this fight. He moves around very well. He looks every bit like a fighter that should make it to the top, but it's just the activity is hurting him, both offensively and defensively actually, because oftentimes you'll see him not even move his head. Strickland was peppering him with the jab and hitting him with the right straight. It wasn't the cleanest right straight either. Throwing it over his shoulder and bringing it downward, almost like it was an overhand, and still able to land it. A pretty slow punch. When he's active, he looks like a fighter that should make it to the top of the rankings, but that doesn't happen too often. And it's crazy because I think he does train with Ciryl Gane. He moves like Ciryl Gane, and when he does those shots, they are pretty clean. They're much cleaner than Sean Strickland. And that's another clear example where one fighter has cleaner striking, better technique, better form, and still loses because his efficiency and effectiveness is not on par with his quote-unquote sloppier opponent. And this is why sometimes the cleaner strikers aren't necessarily the better strikers. That was a perfect example of that. And that put Sean Strickland back on the winning column. Very impressive win, especially taking this on short notice. And he should get a good fight after. Dan Ige had a good knockout. That left shovel hook. In tight, clean technique, walk-off knockout. Beautiful stuff from Dan Ige. Roman Kopylov looked amazing as well, defied the odds in that fight. He was just not missing any strikes. He looked better than I've ever seen him before. I'm very curious to see how he does moving forward in the middleweight division. And it just goes to show you, man, more and more strikers are coming up and not as many grapplers. I wonder when the middleweight division is going to adopt more grapplers to diverse it, because they may have the best strikers in the UFC, but man, they're lacking in the wrestling and grappling department. And even their prospects are looking like it. Caitlin Vieira versus Raquel Pennington, I mean, not much to really say about this fight. Umar, of course, as we know, amazing performance. Didn't even shoot a single takedown and knocked out Raoni Barcelos. That was such an impressive performance. Javid Basharat showed up. Abdul Razak Al Hassan using that speed advantage to get in on Claudio Ribeiro, blitzed him down, and that was pretty much it. He didn't really land anything too clean before that big punch. Just overall a solid fight night card. I actually enjoyed it. Not only did we have a UFC event last weekend, but KSI went out there and just Michael Venom Paged his opponent. It was almost a picture-perfect Michael Venom Page moment. He had his hands down, probing with the left hand as he's bouncing, blitzes down with the right straight into a shifting left hook. I was pretty surprised with KSI doing that. And it just goes to show you, if Dillon Danis was in there, he would not have won that fight at all. KSI would have eviscerated Dillon Danis out there, as crazy as that is to say. And hopefully this is the last time I have to talk about Dillon Danis, because he botched it. He had this persona going on. A lot of people didn't like him, but now it's to the point where nobody wants anything to do with him. Fans don't want to talk about him anymore. Fighters don't want to fight with him. Even KSI said this. But I still can't believe he pulled that whole thing with the KSI fight. Remember when I talked about Dillon Danis getting into that scuffle with that one boxer, and I said it would be smart for KSI to not fight Dillon Danis? This is why. Dillon Danis bailed on the fight, allegedly, we don't know for sure, but allegedly, because he was underprepared, and Ariel even said that to his face. And look what happens. He doesn't show up, and if he did, he probably would have gotten hurt out there. It looked like Dillon Danis knew that this was not a fight that he was going to win. And KSI went to go fight another YouTuber. How can a professional fighter pull out of that fight, and then a gamer steps in? All respect to that guy. I think his name's like FaZe Temper or something. All respect to him. A gamer took this fight over a seemingly professional fighter. How are you going to turn down the fight knowing in advance But this gamer is going to take it up on short notice. And I'm pretty sure this FaZe guy is making money too. He's probably making more money than Danis does. I see some people going to Danis' defense and saying, it'd be embarrassing if he came in there underprepared and lost to KSI. He has a reputation on the line as a fighter. But does he really? Does he really have a reputation as a fighter? At this point, KSI is more of a fighter than Dillon Danis is. He's at least had more professional fights. He's at least getting punched in the head more often than Dillon does. It is so despicable because I personally know guys that go into the gym, training day in and day out, taking up other jobs to support their families and just wearing their body down, training through injury, just hoping that the right moment comes when they can finally make this all worth it. And then Dillon Danis gets that. Dillon Danis gets a fight that almost every single MMA fighter who hasn't got their big shot would have taken. And Danis just pulls out because he wasn't prepared. There's so many guys out here that would have done anything to get that opportunity. And this guy just no-shows it. 99% of fighters out there never get that big break. They dedicate themselves to the sport and nothing happens, even though some guys are relatively talented. Dillon Danis got known because of his ties to Conor McGregor, and it seems like, at least according to Ariel Helwani, that they're not on a similar kind of page anymore. I don't know what's going on there, but he was known for being leashed onto Conor. And that is a guy that Danis should be looking up to, right? Conor is a professional. Conor is a real fighter. Conor is a former champion. He's one of the best fighters we've ever seen. And he would have never have done that. How can you look up to a guy like Conor McGregor and you bail out of a fight because you were not prepared? Conor went in there injured. He went against odds. He fought Nate Diaz, who was much bigger than he was. He's willing to fight welterweights. Went in on short notice and everything. All the media obligations and never complained about it. Never pulled out of a fight. He fought Chad Mendes with practically one leg. Dillon Danis pulling out against KSI. And he'd even say he was injured. There's no reports that he was even injured. Crazy, because I know thousands of people watching, even fans that have never fought before, would have taken this opportunity off the couch. The most annoying thing about it was he wasted everybody's time. He wasted an opportunity, other people's opportunity that could have taken that fight and actually got prepared, be an actual professional. This guy's been around some of the biggest fighters in the world, and he's this unprofessional for fights. A lot of people bring up Conor McGregor when they talk about Dillon Danis. Conor would have never done this. I know Dillon copied a lot of Conor's methods, but this is one thing he did not copy. When Conor signs his name on the line, he will show up no matter what. Dillon Danis pulls out because he's not prepared. The guy had time. What's going on here? Unless he's injured, that's another thing, right? But at least mention that, right? And apparently he said he had to pay some big fee to Bellator and to allow him to fight. I don't even know anymore. At this point, just like many other fighters, just like KSI, the guy has no future in this misfits fighting or whatever it is. A lot of fighters are saying that Dillon Danis should not even be booked to fight anybody anymore. I'm not going to go that far, but I don't blame anybody for not wanting him on cards anymore. So disrespectful and so unprofessional. It's one thing to troll, but it's another thing to do all this. And he threw a drink in KSI's face, got punched outside for it. And this is what he does at the end of the day? It's nothing but catching L's. That's it. It's nothing but taking losses every single time. But now in professional and good news, Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev, an actual fight that we're looking forward to. Gaethje is actually the favorite, so get those bets in now. Of course on mybookie.ag. And man, we've been waiting for this one. Gaethje versus Fiziev, I'll say it right now, is a guaranteed fight of the year candidate. It is going to be so entertaining to watch. I think Fiziev is just too much of a striker, at least on a technical level. But Gaethje has the experience. He has the, get your buttons ready, the dog in him. That he has that about him. He has that heart, that warrior spirit to always be in there and turn a fight around. As long as the fight doesn't get taken to the ground, but Fiziev is not going to try to take this fight to the ground, neither could he. The only way this fight goes to the ground is if Fiziev drops him and then tries to submit him. And even though he has a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think that's more than enough for him to get the back and get a choke. And here's the thing. Justin Gaethje does the majority of his work off of his light kicks, whether the damage from the kicks themselves or the kicks actually set up his own punches, get the opponent to move in a certain way. His kicks always get a reaction out of the opponent when it comes to footwork. Either they move in on him afterward or they move away so he can gauge more. If they move in on him, that's how he's able to catch him with some of his counter shots. That's what he did against Tony Ferguson, for an example. And that is a problem against Rafael Fiziev because Fiziev is going to be defending those kicks just like Charles Oliveira did, but more checks maybe. And you saw in the fight with Oliveira that Gaethje could not really pick out the majority of his punches because he wasn't able to land his kicks. Most of the punches he landed was for the fact that Oliveira walked into them without moving his head at all. That is not the same story with Fiziev, because Fiziev is a much harder target to hit. He is way faster than Oliveira and Gaethje combined, and he's a sharp counter striker. I think speed and variety from Fiziev will win him this fight, as well as defending the leg kicks. If all Gaethje has are his boxing skills against Fiziev, it's hard to see him winning that. But it should be a really fun one. But I think Fiziev's technical ability will be a bit too much for Gaethje to get by. And that will show you the slow change of the guard of the lightweight division, where the Gaethjes, the Poiriers, the Chandlers, and the RDAs, these guys are going to get weeded out by the younger. So Fiziev is going to make his way up there. Arman Tsarukyan's eventually going to get up there. Guram will probably make his way back up there. I would love to say Guram Kutateladze, but he just pulled out of his fight again. The guy just can't stay healthy, can't stay active. As talented as he is, it is very unfortunate, man. It's so sad to see as a fan. The guy's been in the UFC since 2020, has only fought twice. He beat Mateusz Gamrot in his debut, and then lost to Damir Ismagulov in a split decision that a lot of people even thought that Guram won. He was going to get a big fight with Thiago Moises, but, injuries happen, and not only Guram, but Damir is out too. But he's out permanently. He retired from the sport. Yeah, man, Damir retired, and he said it's due to sickness. I don't want to say what he has or anything, because he hasn't disclosed it, but that is also disappointing, because Damir definitely had at least top 7 skills. A great counter striker, great with distance management, and had probably the best jab in the whole weight class. Damir's jab is something people need to study. He uses it so well, and it's 90% of his attacks. Defensively, offensively, he counters with it, moves around with it, gauges to set up his own right hand very well. He had decent wrestling, not on the level of Arman, of course. Arman is a different caliber of a wrestler, but solid wrestling nonetheless. I don't think Damir ever was able to become a champion, or maybe even top 3. But top 5, top 7, I think it would have always been around there. And I have a feeling that Guram is probably going to retire sometime soon as well. Guram is also around his age. He's getting injured left and right. He does have a lot of inspiration from guys like Khamzat in his corner and stuff, but I'll have to say this about Guram. He is definitely a top 5 talent. He has some of the best striking in the whole division. He is extremely powerful with his strikes. Decent wrestler too. He doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, to be honest. I mean, he is a guy that's learning wrestling from Khamzat, unlike other fighters in that camp like Darren Till. Guram is actually learning and getting better in his wrestling. And if he can get it to a point where nobody takes him to the ground, not a lot of guys are going to be able to beat him. But his injuries are unfortunately his biggest weakness. His body's crumbling, man. His body's deteriorating. And the guy just got started in the UFC. It's crazy. I have a feeling he will retire before ever getting to his peak. And hopefully none of that stuff happens to guys like Arman, Gamrot, Jalen Turner, etc. There's a lot of good talent in the lightweight division. But I will have to say, I might have to admit it at this point. I'm starting to think that Bantamweight is the best division in the UFC. It's still a toss-up between that and lightweight, but I think Bantamweight is getting the edge now. They're so technical. I think it's the most skilled weight class in the UFC and the most well-rounded. Nearly all the guys in the top 15 can do everything. But lightweight has a strong roster outside the top 15. That is the biggest thing going for lightweight. There's no other division that has such good fighters non-ranked. And I know some people say that it's because lightweight is the average size person, when that's actually not true. Featherweight is the average size man. Lightweight is a little bit bigger. Remember, we're talking about worldwide, not just the United States, because there's a lot of fighters that are not from the United States in these weight classes. If not, most fighters are not from the United States. The UFC just signed such good talent. A lot of guys can do great things. Charles Oliveira has good offensive Muay Thai and the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he lacks defensively in his striking entirely. And his wrestling isn't all that. You look at Dustin Poirier, he has excellent boxing, but his kicks are kind of lacking. He could throw some calf kicks here and there. And his offensive wrestling is okay. His jiu-jitsu is pretty good. You look at Justin Gaethje, who has great kicks, decent boxing, great takedown defense, but then lacks in the entire grappling department. Islam Makhachev is probably the best grappler in the whole UFC right now. And even though he could do things with his striking, if you compare his striking to the bantamweights, it's on the lower tier, man. It's not comparing at all. You look at Michael Chandler, who is fairly well-rounded, but he's not technical. He can do everything and be dangerous everywhere, but he's not that technical in anything he does besides just his pure wrestling. You look at Arman Tsarukyan right now, amazing wrestler, great grappler on the ground. He's explosive with his strikes, but he's very repetitive with what he uses. He doesn't have a lot of variety to his striking. You look at Jalen Turner, dangerous on the feet, great offense, lacks a bit in the defensive department, and not too strong of a wrestler, decent grappling on the ground. And now look at the bantamweights. Aljamain Sterling, even though he is the champion, he isn't necessarily as well-rounded as some of the other guys. His grappling is so dominant. His striking's okay, he's really good with his distance management. His activity, he has a lot of variety with his striking, but is a bit clunky. Sean O'Malley, Amazing striking all the way around, can scramble on the ground fairly well, but just not that great of wrestling. Peter Yan, some of the best striking in the whole UFC, very good wrestling, and good on the ground as well. He is very well-rounded. Merab, I would have to say, is probably the most one-dimensional fighter. His striking's okay, it's actually not bad, but it doesn't come near his wrestling skills. Chito, good everywhere besides takedown defense. He could do it all on the feet. He's good on the ground as well. Corey Sandhagen, amazing striking, can scramble but just lacks in the takedown defense and offensive wrestling. Rafa has good striking, specifically boxing. He has decent wrestling and decent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Dominic Cruz, good wrestling, good on the ground, good standing up. Song Yadong, pretty much the same kind of thing. Amazing on the feet, decent wrestling, okay on the ground. You got guys like Umar, good everywhere. Striking's really progressing, amazing on the ground, great wrestling, can switch stances and everything like that. And that's another thing about all the bantamweights. Nearly every single bantamweight can switch between orthodox and southpaw and fight equally. Aljamain can do it, O'Malley can do it, Yan, Chito, Sandhagen, Font, Cruz, Umar, Saeed is good everywhere as well. That's why I have to say that bantamweight may be the best division because of how skilled they are. And they're very entertaining. I wouldn't say they're as entertaining as lightweight. Lightweight is banger after banger every single time because you got guys like Oliveira, Poirier, Gaethje, Chandler. These guys go for broke. They try to break their opponent's will, and sometimes it can make it for a relatively sloppy fight or a brawl, but that's what you're going to get in the lightweight division. You're going to get the most exciting fights in the UFC, and that's nearly for everybody in the top 15, and even many of them outside the top 15. Like, who are the fighters that you don't necessarily get that with? You don't get it with Islam. You don't get it too much with Gamrot. RDA, I guess, can be in those. You don't get it too much with Armin. You don't get it too much with Damir, even though he's gone now. He's number 12. And you don't get it too much with Dawson. Every other fighter, you get fireworks. Oliveira, Poirier, Gaethje, Dariush, Chandler, Fiziev, Jalen Turner, Dan Hooker, Renato Moicano, Drew Dober. That is why it's the most lucrative division. And now with this whole Francis Ngannou thing, we know how the heavyweight division is going to play out in the UFC. John Jones versus Ciryl Gane. Curtis Blaydes just called out for Sergey Pavlovich. Stipe is calling for dibs on the next title shot. I don't know if he's going to get it, especially if Blaydes and Pavlovich fight. So what are the options for Francis Ngannou? I'm going to be honest, there's not a lot of fun options for a fan. So we know about the rumors of him going to the PFL, and who is the PFL heavyweight champion? His name's Ante Delia, and he's actually not a bad fighter. Decent boxing skills, good submissions, okay wrestling game. He's fairly slow with his grappling compared to his boxing. His actual hands are pretty quick. He puts together combinations. He doesn't look for like the big one-punch knockout. He's actually a technical boxer in there. He could potentially put some combinations on Francis using his speed advantage. For the size difference, he's a bit smaller than Ngannou. He's 6'5" with a 79-inch reach, but he weighs like 240. As technical as his boxing can be, I don't see him getting by that power. I think Ngannou clips him. He does put up a really tight guard, but his legs are there to be kicked. And off of the leg kicks from Ngannou, I think the punches are going to start landing immediately afterward. I don't think he takes a single punch from Ngannou. And who's the one... So I see Ngannou knocking that guy out in, 2 rounds maybe? I wouldn't give him past 2. And then who's the one championship heavyweight champ? Aryan Bowler? We already know how that would go down. Bowler's a very good wrestler, and maybe he has a path there, but we've seen Ngannou stop really good wrestlers already. They're hardly ever able to take him to the ground, and Bowler's striking is just not up to par at all. I see Bowler getting knocked out fairly quickly as well. The heavyweight champion in Bellator is Ryan Bader. Do I have to say any more? And can you imagine Ngannou at bare knuckle fighting? He'd be ending people over there. The champion's Arnold Adams gets obliterated. He's a decent boxer for MMA, decent counter striker, good defense, but I see him getting crushed by Ngannou. And then we can look at even boxing. I don't care to really see him fight Tyson Fury that much. I think Tyson Fury schools him from beginning to end. The only guy I would like to see Ngannou fight is Deontay Wilder. It's the only fight for me at least that's interesting because it's not a blowout. Both guys have a chance here, and let's be honest, both guys' boxing skills are rudimentary. Wilder's of course the better boxer, but his skill level is at least low enough to where Ngannou can catch him. It's honestly the only fight for Francis Ngannou that seems somewhat interesting. After that, what's there? I mean, if he beats Deontay Wilder, I guess his next step would be Tyson Fury or something, but that's where his road pretty much stops. If he goes to any of these other MMA organizations, I'm gonna be honest, I really don't care that much. It's like watching him fight B-level heavyweights, and it would feel like we're missing out on him fighting the best heavyweights in the world that are absolutely in the UFC. There are some divisions, like in one championship, where they have good fighters in the lower weight classes. Christian Lee's a good fighter, Demetrius Johnson, of course, Tong Kai's pretty good. But when it comes to the heavyweight division, UFC has absolutely the best of the best. I mean, if Sergey Pavlovich went to any other organization, he would dominate everybody. Or Curtis Blades, or even Derek Lewis would get a championship belt somewhere. And when you really think about these options, it leaves you to wonder, does the UFC actually get hurt by Ngannou leaving? Because we're still excited about the fights that can happen there, but we're not so excited about Ngannou's options outside the UFC. It's a shame Ngannou left now, when the heavyweight division is as good as it is as stacked as it's ever been. Right, we got Ciryl Gane, we got John Jones, Stipe, Aspinall, Pavlovich, Blades. Spivak is looking pretty good. Romanov is looking good. Volkov, Lewis, Tuivasa, and Rosenstrike are all pretty good fighters for the heavyweight division. And you have the Almeida guy coming up. Leaving now is crazy, man. It's so disappointing for a fan, but I understand it from his perspective. If he doesn't feel like he's getting what he deserves, by all means, he should do the best for his career. But man, that's a bummer. I would have loved to see Ngannou fight Jones. It's one of those fights that's going to go down as the fight that never happened. You know, the Khabib versus Tony, the Anderson versus GSP. Now we have Ngannou versus Jones. I would have loved to see him fight Pavlovich. I would have loved to see him eventually fight Aspinall. Even a rematch with Ciryl Gane and Stipe. Those are still fights that need to happen. And they're all gone. I mean, hopefully Ngannou does come back later after going wherever he wants to go. But we still got to be positive about the heavyweight division. It's still looking really good without Ngannou. And I'm going to be honest here. When you look at Curtis Blades' chances now to become a champion, it's looking really good. Because Ngannou was his biggest hurdle. He just couldn't get past that guy. With Ngannou out, it's going to be really hard to stop Curtis Blades from getting that belt. Jones will still be a good fight. That's an interesting one. I think Stipe and Blades is a good fight as well. We'll see where Pavlovich's takedown defense is, because last time we saw it, it did not look good at all. I mean, Overeem was dominating him on the ground. Gane is going to get taken down and dominated. There is no clear fight where Curtis Blades outright loses. Every top fight is either competitive or he dominates his opponent. And if Ciryl Gane gets that belt, let's say if he does beat Jones, and Blades, let's say, beats Pavlovich, because he probably will be the favorite going into it, Blades is getting that belt 100%. Really interesting times in the heavyweight division. And over the weekend, I had some interesting conversations, and it's something that you guys have asked me as well. It's regarding the greatest strikers in UFC history. Who are the best strikers? Now, I'll have to preface with this. It could seem kind of silly to even discuss who the best striker is, who the best grappler is, in a sport where everything is mixed and nothing is pure. You can't be a pure striker. You can't be a pure grappler. You got to do everything. That's why wrestlers can outstrike strikers, because of the threat of the takedown. That's why Khabib is not getting obliterated by Justin Gaethje or Conor McGregor. He has the wrestling and the takedown threat at a constant. That's why Derek Brunson can knock out Lyoto Machida. Would you ever say that Derek Brunson's a better striker than Lyoto? Never in a million years. But he knocked him out in the first round without even shooting a single takedown. But it is a pretty fun discussion to make regarding the best striking performances. That's kind of where you have to go to, right? And which guy are they outstriking? If you're outstriking CM Punk, no one cares. But if you're outstriking Leon Edwards, now that's a pretty big deal, right? And everybody knows who the top guys are. I think we can all agree that Alex Pereira is the best striker we've ever seen in the UFC. Anderson and Adesanya are kind of interchangeable, and we're talking about prime. After that, you can kind of mix it up, right? You could put Volkanovski, you could put Aldo, you could put Wonderboy. Maybe some people include Conor in there or something, Dustin, I don't know. But what I will say is, if Volk continues to put on those striking performances like he put on Max Holloway, and it wasn't kind of like a one-off thing. I mean, he did the same to the Korean Zombie, but different caliber of striker. If he's performing like that constantly now, let's say he beats Yair Rodriguez and has the same kind of striking skill that he showed against Holloway or something like that, you might have to put him concretely right behind those top three guys as the number 4 greatest striker in UFC history. The only reason why he's in the mix right now is because we need to see more of it. Is it consistent? Because look at Max Holloway for an example. Max put a striking clinic on Kelvin Kattar, unlike we've ever seen before. That still today might be the greatest striking performance in UFC history, but he wasn't able to continuously and consistently put those kind of performances on other fighters. But Max is also kind of in the mix there too, so who stands out in that mix? Who's going to stand out of those guys? It's really hard to pick. Ciryl Gane has an advantage in this kind of list because there aren't a lot of good heavyweight strikers, so he looks like he's worlds apart from everybody. Conor has some of the best striking performances we've seen, but then there's times where he's getting outstruck in fights, or is being more competitive than it should be, like in the Nate Diaz fights. But then again, he has given up a lot of weight to his opponent. Conor was at his best at featherweight, and that prime Conor McGregor and the one that beat Eddie Alvarez absolutely can be in the mix here with Volk and Holloway and Wonderboy and all these guys. I can already see some people might be putting Jose Aldo lower for the fact that he has been outstruck so many times in his career against better guys like Peter Yan, Conor McGregor, Max Holloway. Chad Mendes went to war with him. Marlon Moraes and him are almost even. So because of that, I can see the argument that he's probably not in that mix as the number 4 guy. And his best striking performances honestly were against wrestlers because he had the greatest takedown defense ever seen. But if you were to ask me who would stand out, I would have to say it's either Peter Yan, Wonderboy, or Volkanovski. The thing that does go against Wonderboy though is he has been outstruck in fights, but most of them were by wrestlers. And it's because of the threat of the takedown. He has some of the weaker wrestling skills out of all of these strikers. So when a wrestler is fighting him, he's automatically going to be a lot more tentative. And his whole thing with getting knocked out by Pettis is he was winning the whole fight. I mean, he was dominating Pettis with his striking and then just makes one mistake and that's all it costed him. Which happens, you know. Glover Teixeira, for an example, got submitted by Yuri Prochazka. He should never be getting submitted by Yuri Prochazka, but that's part of the game. You know, you make a mistake, you get submitted. That's all it is. Glover has still shown to be a much better grappler than Yuri throughout his career. And when you talk about Corey Sandhagen, I mean, who's outstruck him? Peter Yan, even though it was a crazy good fight, and nobody else. John Lineker landed a good punch. Song Yudong and him were going back and forth, but that just shows how good Song is in striking. We have to see more from him to see if he is consistent with that. TG got outstruck. He's consistently been shown to be a genius of a striker. It's a really interesting topic. And then you talk about guys like Robert Whittaker. You talk about George St. Pierre. You talk about Davison Figueiredo. A lot of people don't look at Davison as that great of a striker, but when you really think about it, he's a menace on the feet. More skilled than people think he is, and his power is just outrageous. And hear me out when I talk about Darren Till. I'm not going to count Darren Till as like one of the best strikers, but the weird thing about Darren Till is, yes, there's not a good light on him right now. He is losing a lot of fights. Most of them are from wrestling, but the guy was able to strike with Wonderboy and Robert Whittaker and do very well against them. But then he gets KO'd by Jorge Masvidal and doesn't look good on the feet against Duplessis. That's why consistency is so important when you're talking about this sort of thing. Because if we're looking strictly on the Wonderboy fight, Darren Till is definitely a higher tier striker. But when you look at the totality of his career, is he really? Darren does fairly well against that distance karate style. Because as soon as he fought Jorge, he couldn't fight him the same way. The more patient the fight is, the better he's going to perform in the stand-up. And with that, let's go right to the questions. We're going to start with Clifford Wilson. What's your personal pick for the end of the year awards? So my knockout of the year for 2022, this is a tough one to pick. I know a lot of people are going to say Leon Edwards, but I have a different view on knockout of the year. I think the Leon knockout, even though it was a spectacular high kick, and who he did it to was crazy and all of that stuff, I think the biggest thing about that was more of the comeback factor than the knockout itself, right? So I look more of the technique of what they did to get that knockout, which is why I hold like Jean-Wei Li's knockout over Joanna as such high regard. That could be it, or I would say Demetrius Johnson knocking out Adriano Moraes. That knockout was spectacular from the technique, the way he manipulated that whole sequence to get Moraes to fall into his right hand. I made a whole breakdown on how he conditioned Moraes so intelligently, it still goes down as some of the best feinting I've ever seen in a fight. Demetrius Johnson is still one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen, even at his older age. And flyweights, bantamweights, you don't see a lot of 36-year-olds, man, especially at this level of the game. And he's undersized. He's undersized, old, at a lighter division, and still on top. The further he goes, if he continues with this kind of success, he may be regarded as the greatest fighter of all time. So my pick would be Demetrius Johnson knocking out Adriano Moraes. My submission of the year, it is not Islam versus Charles or Charles versus Gaethje. I think Jessica Andrade's submission over Amanda Lemos is insane. That might take it, but Yuri's submission over Glover, it was crazy with the fact that he didn't have a full rear naked choke, and he submitted Glover of all people. So the rear naked choke wasn't necessarily that impressive. Him not getting the full back take was impressive, and who he did it to was super impressive. So because of who he submitted, I would probably go with Yuri Prochazka submitting Glover Teixeira as the submission of the year, but Jessica Andrade's submission against Amanda Lemos is right behind it. Fight of the year is for sure Yuri versus Glover. Banger of the year, so the wildest fight, I would have to say, is probably Dustin and Chandler. Or Onama versus Lenware. Schnell versus Sumo is pretty crazy. I'd probably go with Dustin versus Chandler. That fight was just wildness the whole time. From when Michael Chandler started bombing Dustin on the feet after the accidental headbutt. I mean, we do have to always point that out. It was a very dirty fight, especially from Chandler. And then went into slamming Dustin, landing ground and pound shots. Dustin getting back up, started taunting Chandler, putting the combinations on his chin. That one left hand that drilled Chandler's head into the cage was wild to see him take it. And then Chandler comes back using his wrestling advantage to dominate that second round. Almost got the rear naked choke with fish hooks involved and all of it. Then we go into the third round and Chandler picks Dustin up and slams him, overcommits on it, and Dustin intelligently reverses the position by grabbing onto the foot and then eventually gets that rear naked choke in there. It had everything you want in a wild, wild fight, man. That is the kind of fight you're going to get your money's worth for. I mean, the fact that it was so dirty just added on to the rawness that fight was. But for sure, Chandler, don't be fish hooking people anymore. We rarely ever see fish hooks, and this guy was doing it. Tried everything he could to get that win. That had me up in my seat more than any other fight. Fighter of the year is Alex Pereira, for the fact that he went from non-ranked to champion in a single year. He fought 3 times, which is more than any other fighter that got the belt did last year. And he beat Israel Adesanya with one of the greatest comebacks as well. Fighter in the hottest water of the year. So like a fighter that seemingly was probably going to get cut or something and just turn it around. I would say Michael Johnson, right? Michael Johnson entered 2022 on a 4-loss streak, and they knocked out Ellen Patrick. He lost a split decision to Jamie Malarkey, which was very close, and then beat Mark Giacchese as an underdog. A sizable underdog too, so I would say that would go to Michael Johnson, as it probably always will. I would have to say the prospect of the year was Sergey Pavlovich, because he went from unranked to beating Shamil, Derek Lewis, and Tai Tuivasa in a single year. He beat all these guys in just above a round, so he's definitely the prospect of that year. And the most improved fighter of the year. This one's really tough. That could also go to Sergey Pavlovich, because he was coming off a huge layoff before 2022. He didn't fight for almost 3 years. It wasn't too far off his Alistair Overeem loss. And then doing what he did in 2022 was crazy. So he might be the winner of the best improved fighter. Or technically speaking, Matthias Nicolau might be the guy. Matthias Nicolau was performing on a level we haven't seen ever from him before. To the point where people were starting to say he was overrated and stuff until he absolutely destroyed Matt Schnell. When he destroyed Matt Schnell, everyone's like, okay, this guy's so much better than we've ever seen him. So I would probably have to pick Matthias Nicolau. And then who do you think would win in a possible slap fight between Conor and Nate? Who would possibly beat Ngannou in a slap fight? Nate wouldn't lose to anybody. I put him up against Ngannou. No one beats Ngannou. I don't like this whole slap fight stuff. Do you guys like this? They're not even slapping each other. Most of the time it looks like they're palming each other in the face. That's like getting punched in the face. And you don't even break your hand doing it. I see the technique a lot of these guys use, man. And then we go to J-Mate. Ranked the hardest punchers in combat sports history. The majority of the hardest punchers are going to come from boxing because they hit harder than the other martial artists and other sports. But there are going to be some other guys, like Francis Ngannou is of course going to be on that list. In fact, he might be really high on that list. There is an argument I'm seeing out there that boxers don't hit as hard as we think they do because they're wearing boxing gloves. And with boxing gloves that have extra padding, you're going to be able to punch harder without worrying about breaking your hand. And I see that as well. Maybe in MMA, they're not able to hit as hard sometimes in fear of breaking their own hands. I don't agree with this because in a fight, they'll do anything possible, even breaking their hand to win the fight. So I don't think it's going to change that too much, but boxing gloves can make you hit harder, especially if you're wearing 8 or 10 ounces. It's possible. I have to do more research on that, but ranking the hardest punchers in combat sports history, number 1 is Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder hits harder than anybody ever. The guy touches you and you go to sleep, and that's not even what George Foreman or Mike Tyson or even Ernie Shavers was able to do. Number 2, I'll say, is Francis Ngannou because he does a very similar thing. In MMA, he touches you once and you just fall. Him knocking out Cain Velasquez with that short of an uppercut still to this day boggles my mind of how powerful that guy is. Number 3, I'll say, is Ernie Shavers. Ernie Shavers is repeatedly throughout history to be known as the hardest puncher ever in boxing up until Deontay Wilder. Then I'm going to put in George Foreman. George Foreman has been historically known to also be one of the hardest punchers. Guys like Evander Holyfield, who has fought a bunch of heavy punchers, has said that George Foreman at his older age hit him harder than anybody else ever did. And his 8 knockdowns against Joe Frazier was a clear example of that. After those 4 guys, it gets pretty difficult to rank the biggest punchers. I would have to put Derek Lewis after that, or you can argue that he's above George Foreman maybe, for the fact that he has that much power in one punch, whereas George Foreman has oftentimes hit fighters multiple times to put him to the ground, where that is almost never happening for Derek Lewis. After that, in no order, you have Mike Tyson, of course, you have Rocky Marciano, you have Joe Louis, Jack Dempsey, David Tua, Mark Hunt, Shane Carwin, Sergey Pavlovich. You can rank these guys in any order. And then with the Philip Funk 1797. Best gatekeepers each division has had. Love your content, dude, keep it up. So first we gotta define what a gatekeeper is. The way I always saw gatekeeper was the guy at the gate before you get into the elite of the division. And that can mean different things for different divisions. Like heavyweight is going to have a gatekeeper probably higher up in the rankings. Whereas for lightweight, they might be lower in the rankings, considering the skill difference between those two divisions. So for heavyweight, I might say Derek Lewis. Maybe. But then again, he fought for the belt and he did beat Curtis Blades, and Blades is definitely one of the elite of the division. And he beat Ngannou too. I might say the best gatekeeper at heavyweight was the older Andrei Arlovski. If you beat Arlovski, you always made it to the top of the division. So yeah, that happened for Francis Ngannou, happened for Overeem, happened for Rosenstrike, Tai Tuivasa. Even when Stipe beat Andrei Arlovski, he went to fight for the belt. For light heavyweight, I would say Ovince St. Preux. For middleweight, this is a toss-up between Michael Bisping before he got older, because that's when he became a champion, but he was a gatekeeper for a long time, and also Derek Brunson. These two, I say, are kind of equal. But the fact that Bisping did become a champion, so that might mean that Derek Brunson is the better gatekeeper. For welterweight, I'll say Neil Magny. He's been the gatekeeper for so many years. Lightweight, I'll say Edson Barboza. For featherweight, I'll say Jeremy Stevens. For bantamweight, it's Pedro Munoz. And for flyweight, it is a relatively newer division, but it might be Tim Elliott. He did fight for the belt once, but for a long time before getting cut from the UFC, and even now, he's essentially a gatekeeper. And then for the women's bantamweight division, at this point, it's probably Holly Holm. Holly Holm's been a gatekeeper for a while. And it's crazy because she's consistently been in the top 5, but that's how shallow the division is, that a fighter in the top 5 can be the gatekeeper. The women's flyweight division, I'll say Lauren Murphy. And then the strawweight division, it's 100% Tisha Torres. And remember, gatekeeper does not mean a bad fighter. Gatekeepers are good fighters. They're just on the outside of the best fighters. Then we go to Vijam the Ninja. First of all, I pretty recently got into MMA, and your channel has been amazing for helping me understand both general and finer points of the sport, and it's helped me appreciate it so much more. So thanks, man. Keep it up. Love your stuff. Thanks so much, man. That really means a lot. I just try my best. Number 1, it seems to be like Sambo and wrestling specialists in MMA seem to have an edge over other specialists in other specific martial arts, especially strikers. Maybe it's just me, but this seems to be a growing trend. Will there be some new anti-wrestling technique to counter this? What special weapons should fighters focus on if, say, your Justin Gaethje wants to have a chance against an Islam Makhachev? That's an interesting question. Now, people have to remember something about Sambo, because yes, wrestling has been the most dominant in MMA throughout its history, but Sambo is different. You can look at Sambo as essentially a mixture of various different grappling arts. Sambo is the most complete form of grappling, so they're doing everything. And also a lot of Sambo fighters are from combat Sambo as well, which is pretty much MMA. Khabib, Islam, Umar, Khamzat, all these guys, they've also competed in combat Sambo, not just Sambo. All of these Sambo fighters are striking fairly well too. They're not just grappling. They're not a Damian Maia. They're not a Ben Askren. Those days are done. There are rarely any more specialists in the sport. So I would be reluctant to call them specialists, because Islam is not necessarily a specialist. He outstruck Charles Oliveira. Khabib was striking very well with Conor. And the fact that they even attempted to strike with these guys and has some success shows you that they're not specialists. They're so strong in that area, but they can do other things as well. Khabib did very well on the feet, even with Edson Barboza, with Michael Johnson, Justin Gaethje, and okay against Dustin Poirier. Dustin was the guy that he really needed to take to the ground to have success. But the more interesting part of your question, I would say, is there a new anti-wrestling technique to counter these Sambo skills? I don't think there is like one new technique. I think fighters have to adopt this. They have to get more familiar with Sambo, with this Dagestani wrestling style. This is what they have to do. Just like when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came into the scene, there was no anti-Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique. You had to learn it. And I think what guys like Khabib have brought to the sport, fighters need to practice this now. And you've seen it before. I mean, look at Alistair Overeem. You look at various fighters who have gotten into similar positions that Khabib has mastered and made popular. Fighters are doing that now. But you need more fighters in order to understand it, right? Dustin, Gaethje, Conor, these guys didn't study Sambo when they fought Khabib like that. They just studied against Khabib specifically, but they didn't get into that martial art of Sambo. And that's what these fighters need to do now. And number 2, kind of a follow-up of the first question, it also seems that more and more up-and-coming fighters have to learn to be increasingly well-rounded in all martial arts. Will this lead to something of a standardization of fighting styles to cover all bases? And will this, in turn, lead to the decline of more unorthodox fighting styles? Like, for example, how Pereira has to become increasingly less extravagant in a style the higher up in the rankings he climbs. That's a very good question. I don't think so. Because these quote-unquote unorthodox fighting styles are always going to be unorthodox. They're always going to be unpredictable. That's why Yuri Prohaska can submit Glover Teixeira. John Joe's always had a very unorthodox style, and he's essentially the greatest fighter we've ever seen in the octagon. Davidson Figueiredo is somewhat unorthodox, and he's the champion right now. Being well-rounded is not a uniform thing. It's not going to cause fighters to fight similarly, because there's a lot of martial arts and a lot of things that can work. When we talk about well-roundedness, we're more talking about grappling, wrestling, and striking. Those are the bare bones of mixed martial arts. You have the stand-up striking, you have the wrestling to get the fight to the ground and hold positions, and then you have the grappling, which is like your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsus, your Judos, your various Sambo techniques and all of that while you're on the ground. And there's many forms of these, right? There's different forms of wrestling. There's folk style, freestyle. The Dagestanis have different kind of wrestling shots. You do have also judo skills that you can get the fighter to the ground with. You have the Greco-Roman styles. Like, there's so many different kind of wrestling styles that you can incorporate in the sport. But wrestling seems to be the easiest to kind of just look at it as one thing, when in fact there's many different kind of styles. And then we talk about the grappling. We just said Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Sambo and Judo, and there's a bunch of different things you could do on the ground that's completely different from each other. But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu definitely dominates in that area because essentially the whole style is to fight off your back. And then, of course, with striking, there's not one way to strike. You do have boxing, you have Muay Thai, various forms of karate, you have Taekwondo, and even just looking at the simple boxing style, there's different forms there too. There's different ways to box. There's not one way to do it. So you're always going to have different styles. Taekwondo and karate are always going to be seen as unorthodox. It's pretty funny because they're essentially like the origins of striking. But in these days, people look at boxing and Muay Thai as the basics of striking. It really opens up your mind when you think about the traditional martial arts. Karate, Taekwondo, all of these. They're always going to be seen as unorthodox. And actually, I will say this. Techniques used in Taekwondo and Karate are very useful, especially when you have other forms to rely on. I don't think Taekwondo is good as a base. I think it's good to add on several techniques you can take out of that sport. The side kick, some of the turning kicks. But to rely on Taekwondo and build stuff around your Taekwondo style, that is very hard to do. Guys like Wonderboy can do that with his karate, and you're barely ever going to see that. It's going to be much more common for fighters to bring those quote-unquote unorthodox techniques into their boxing, Muay Thai, wrestling styles. But great question, man. I think with the counter 795, which champions do you think will lose their belts in 2023? And which prospects, Makhachev, Topuria, Shavkat, etc., do you think has the best chance of becoming champion first? Love the content, keep up the good work, man. I already made a video about champions are going to lose their belts, but talking about the prospects that might win the belt first. Well, at this point, I don't consider Topuria or Shavkat a prospect. I mean, you can, but I just don't do it because they are in the top 10. If you're in the top 10, I don't see you as a prospect anymore. But if we're going to consider guys young like Shavkat and Topuria and Makhachev, the next one that would win the belt is either Shavkat or Umar, considering where they're ranked and their styles up against the champions. Shavkat has a very good style against Leon, and Umar has a very good style against Sterling as well. Actually, against most of the fighters in the weight class. Topuria is going to have a hard time with Volkanovski. I think it's a competitive fight, especially later when he does fight for the belt. I'm not saying right now. And the reason why I'm not going to name Makhachev is for the fact that he's probably not going to fight for the belt until after all these guys do, or whatever happens in their careers, let's say even if they fall off. But that goes into question as well. Would Makhachev ever fall off? I don't think so. I think Makhachev might have the most success, him or Umar. I think Makhachev and Umar are about a for sure future champion, whereas Topuria and Shavkat, it's tougher for them. So I'll go with Umar in that one. Then we go to Dustin Kilburn. Weasel, why is it impossible to find any footage of Till's supposed K1 Euro Muay Thai run? Moicano wants answers. You are seriously the S tier in MMA YouTube and everybody knows it. Thank you for your time, dedication, and passion for this beautiful sport. No problem, man. Thank you so much, man. That means a lot, and I'm just doing my thing, man. So any footage of Till's supposed Muay Thai run? I have never seen it. So it must have been really underground or something, because I would have to think they would televise or at least record some of that stuff, if it was a big deal at least. Because he's not fighting in the 1910s, where there's barely any footage of most of the fighters. He had that run in the digital era, so yeah, I have no idea. What if it was fake? I'm not going to say it's fake, because he's a good striker. But imagine he pulled off what that one guy did that came in the UFC and faked his record. Askar Mazarov. That would be hilarious, but Darren Till will be the success story of that. And then we went to Ian Childress. The UFC has had several eras since the founding of the company. It seems like we may be in the entertainment era currently. How many eras would you say the company has had, and how would you summarize each of them, pros and cons? As always, thanks for the content. This is an interesting question. So let me think here. You had the Royce Gracie era, which was the beginning. Then you had kind of the Matt Hughes, Chuck Liddell, Fedor Emelianenko era. spanning in 2 different organizations. After that, you had the Anderson Silva GSP era. Then came in Jon Jones, Jose Aldo, the switch up of the heavyweight champions, from Cain Velasquez to JDS, that whole thing. After you had the Conor McGregor era, and everybody wanted to be like Conor. And now you have the current era. So that's 6 eras. Now, the pros and cons of each. The Royce Gracie era, the pro of it was obviously it started the sport. There was a rawness to it because it didn't have many rules. And it brought together different martial arts inside of one arena to see which one was the best. Which is a crazy good concept. The cons of it was, again, barely any rules, so you saw a bunch of craziness, and it didn't attract the best martial artists in the world, right? You didn't get the best boxers, you didn't get the best wrestlers, and the best karate fighters, and kickboxers, and all of that. You didn't get the best of them because it wasn't promoted enough. Now you're starting to get the best wrestlers, and judokas, and kickboxers, and stuff, Alex Pereira, Henry Cejudo, Yoel Romero, Kayla Harrison, etc. You're getting the best of the best because it's lucrative enough where you can make that kind of money. The only sport that they don't need to do that is boxing. The best boxers don't need to come to the sport, and they probably never will unless YouTube boxing just takes over completely. So there was that issue as well. And of course, this is going to be a similar thing with all of the eras before the current. They weren't as good of fighters, but they were the foundation, so how could they be? And then you had the Chuck Liddell, Fedor, Matt Hughes era, and this is when rivalry started to really brew. Tito and Ken Shamrock, Tito and Chuck Liddell, Cro Cop and Fedor had a big anticipated rivalry. Randy Couture switching divisions, and that's another thing, came in the weight classes, right? You had the heavyweight champion, at one time it was Mark Coleman, all the way down to the lightweight division, which was off and on. They excluded it, then included it again, so it caused BJ Penn to really fight around. You still had those raw fights, but with rules placed on top of them. But that was the beginning of your spectacle. And then came in your Anderson Silvas and GSPs and Uriah Fabers. These guys brought a whole different level of skills to the table. These guys are so much better than the previous generation. The gap was so large. And that's where you start to see dominant champions, and the actual belts mean something. Because the dominant champions consistently wanted to fight. They didn't chase other things, right? They were focused on their careers and defending the title, becoming a dominant force in their weight classes. And that caused a bit of influence on the younger fighters coming up to want to do the same kind of thing. And that was such a great thing. And that's why you also saw the most dominant champions in UFC history all in that era. I call that the golden era. And this is when people were anticipating a lot more of super fights. The sport actually looked like a real professional top-notch sport. And that's why I really got into it too. Then after, you had the Jon Jones, the Jose Aldos, the switch up of the heavyweight champions, the rise of Strikeforce. There wasn't too much to say about this era. You could even look at it as an extension of the golden era. It was more of the same, but you definitely saw a lot more interviews happening, a lot more media involved. So I'll say this was one of the more lackluster eras, but ironically, the heavyweight division was like the most popping division of the time. And you also did have the fall of some of the dominant champions, right? That's when Chris Weidman became champ. That's when Johnny Hendricks had his fight with GSP. Brock Lesnar was out. Cain Velasquez, JDS were switching titles. Verdum eventually got his. Stipe was on his way up. And then we go into the Conor McGregor era. This is like 2014 to like 2018. By the time he lost to Khabib, the Conor McGregor era was done, and we went into the current era. So in this one, we all know what the pros were. Money. Fighters understood more of their value, and they try to market themselves. This is when you start to see, YouTube actually being a thing for fighters, or other various media outlets online, as this was the time that fighters wanted to make the most money possible. And you had fighters like Ronda Rousey trying out movies and stuff. Tyron Woodley was doing a similar kind of thing. GSP, even though he was in hiatus, he was going into movies and stuff like that. And you had amazing performances throughout. The middleweight title changing hands from Chris Weidman to Luke Rockhold to Michael Bisping to eventually GSP, and then it gets vacated. You saw the competitive fights with Jon Jones, right? Jon Jones was actually getting tested, right? In the previous generation, he was cleaning out those older guys. In the Conor McGregor era, he was having those very competitive fights with guys of that generation. And this is also when Dominic Cruz lost his belt, and it looked like Cody Garbrandt was going to be your next big star. That was the big thing. Stars. This is when the UFC was looking for their next big stars, and even the fans were. And I believe this was the inclusion of the flyweight division, like around this time as well. So those were the pros. The cons, there was much more politics between the fighters in terms of taking up fights and all of that. Fighters are much more willing to turn down opponents at this time, and it's because they were trying to get the most money possible. And during the Conor McGregor era, this is when the new rule system came into place, and USADA came along. And now we go into the current era. And the pro of the current era, the skills hit another level again. There's a gap between this one and the previous. The fighters now are the best they've ever been, by far. So there's one good thing and one issue about activity. There are certain fighters, especially the younger ones, that want to fight more often. But then you have some of the older fighters, or eventually when they become champions, if they make it high up on the list, that's where they start to decline a lot of fights or demand a lot of things that forces them out of action. Look what just happened with Francis Ngannou, who held up the division for such a long time. He was also injured, but he was regularly fighting like one time a year. Look at the top of the lightweight division when nobody was fighting each other. Welterweight was like that as well. Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal. I mean, there was a bunch of guys just weren't fighting. But you tend to see a lot of activity on the younger guys coming up, more than ever before. And also, this generation has the best fights. And then we go to JG. I went back and watched some of your older videos, and I'm so happy with how far you've come. Where does 2022 rank for you personally and professionally? What are some highlights for you and your channel/MMA work? Love the channel, love the content. Looking forward to 2023 from you. Thank you so much, man. I actually never went back and reflected on 2022 for myself. 2022 was a big year for me, both personally and professionally. So we look at professionally, the growth of the channel, more fans getting involved. And this was my mission the entire time, and it's amazing to see it actually flesh out like that. And also, a big part of it was, it seems like a lot more fighters are noticing the work. They're actually getting involved with the community, and that is just insane to me, right? They've commented on videos, they've shared videos, Bellator fighters, UFC fighters, retired fighters, just a whole bunch of them in 2022. I was quoted on ESPN MMA, RT Sports, reached out by various companies. And the great thing I like to see from that is that fighters are really getting involved with online content, because I think it's very important going further, right? Online content for the sport is only going to push the sport further. Imagine if the sport didn't have any online content. It'd be so much more dull. And there wouldn't really be a direct communication with like fans to the sport, you know? With online content, fans can become content creators and learn more for the sport and spread it out more. Great for the brasses, great for the fighters, everybody involved. And I also do believe that I've grown so much in my breakdowns, my analytical ability. I mean, I've looked back at some of my older breakdowns and they don't even compare to the newer stuff I've done. I mean, the fact that Wonderboy even acknowledges a breakdown that I've done on him just speaks to how much better I've become with my analysis. And Jose Aldo and Jorge, Michael Venom Page, etc. There was many fighters that reached out for the content or to me personally in 2022. I've learned so much, and I think I'm conveying that pretty well. At least that's what it looks like from you guys. You know, when you guys give me feedback, it seems like I am getting better with my analysis as well, which is always going to happen, you know? It's amazing for me to actually see the feedback, because whether it's positive or negative, I always listen to what you guys have to say, because of course, not everybody knows everything. Even fighters get plenty of things wrong in the very sport they compete in. And there's a great example of this, actually. A lot of people don't even know this. So Cain Velasquez was supposed to fight Fabricio Verdum, and he came into Mexico City late. He had a pre-fight interview, and I think Megan O'Leary was also on stage. And one of the fans had a question, and he asked Cain Velasquez, why didn't you come sooner? Because don't you think coming so late is going to affect your cardio? And remember, Cain Velasquez was known as Cardio Cain. Never gassed out, right? But Cain and Megan O'Leary brushed him aside, said, you're not a fighter, you don't know. What happened in the fight? Imagine if that guy spoke to Cain weeks before, even months before, and Cain took his advice. That guy would have probably have saved them from a loss. How crazy is that? And some of the most intelligent fighters have even acknowledged that they don't know everything, right? Sometimes they'll get good advice in random places that they didn't expect. And that's true with every profession in the world, not just fighting. Now, personally, where does 2022 rank for me? It's been very different. I became much more of an adult in 2022, or at least I had a lot more adult responsibilities. Like, I bought my first house. I don't talk too much of what I'm doing personally, but I can tell you guys here. I mainly bought it for my family. For myself, man, I can live in an apartment. I can live in some small space. I don't need too much. But for my family, I moved them in. It's a fairly big house, and it's for them. I want them to live comfortably. I want them to have the kind of life that they always wanted. For example, a lot of people don't know this, but I have a single parent, right? I've been raised by a single parent ever since I was 10 years old. My father passed away when I was 10 due to lung and bladder cancer. And life was tough, man. I'm not gonna lie, life was really tough. My mom had to work 3 jobs to raise 3 kids. You know, one of the kids went down a completely different road, not a great road, and led to even more problems for my mom and caused even more stress than she already had as being a single parent in not a great area. She had to also worry now about me and my brother following certain footsteps. I'm not going to really say too much about that, but following certain footsteps and going down the wrong path, because I can speak for myself. The friends I had were not good influences at all, to put it lightly. Thankfully for her, she really helped me and my brother down the right path. And she didn't have to tell me, but I've always known the kind of life that she wanted. And the kind of stuff that she went through while being married, it was a really rough life that she had. And all I wanted was to give her the life that she deserves. And that's practically, at least I think I've done that. She tells me I've done that for her. But I used to always tell myself, if I ever made any money, firstly, I want to make it so she gets the life that she always deserved. And at an older age, she finally got it. And she's content with it. She's happy and satisfied. So that was ultimately a goal with getting a house, with getting her a car and everything like that. You know, I've spent my money on my family more than I've ever spent on myself. I mean, my car just broke down, but I still drive the same 2011 Saturn. I mean, that company doesn't even make cars anymore. But I got my family new cars and stuff like that. Personally, that is where I'm very satisfied, where I'm very happy. And I'm also working on other stuff. You know, I've mentioned it before in other podcasts that I do have other passions. I do other things. For an example, I am a story writer. I've been writing stories ever since I was a little kid, and I've always been fascinated in doing this. I could keep you guys updated on what's going to happen with that. But then looking at any downs of 2022, it was the year I kind of gave up on becoming a professional fighter, or at least chasing a long-term professional fighting career. It was fairly tough with the sicknesses that I ran into. I was mostly sick in 2021, but I reflected on it in 2022. I don't even have a fraction of the commitment into fighting that some of these professional fighters have. And I can absolutely now imagine how tough it is to say goodbye to the sport. It's probably so heartbreaking for them. You know, I might have a regret of never chasing the sport for a long time. And I am content with it. I've made the decision. And for those that don't know, the main reason why I'm not going to pursue it anymore, the main reason why I walked past pursuing it was when I was sick and I couldn't train for a while. I quickly turned my focus into other things. And I can just imagine if I ever got injured or if I ever got sick during my career that I've committed to, that I wouldn't even want to do it anymore, right? If I'm injured and I have to sit out for a few months, I might never return after that. That's just how my brain works. If I have too much time off of something, I immediately go into something else. And I don't want to commit to a sport and then one day, because injuries are so common and sicknesses and stuff like that, staph infections, all that stuff are so common, I never want to be in that position where I've committed years, have multiple fights on my record, and then I quickly move on from it because I know that would happen. So yeah, man, 2022 was a great year, personally and professionally, and I'm so thankful I can share all of this stuff with you guys. Because I'm not going to lie, a lot of times before I make a video, I think about what the audience is going to think. I get so excited and providing this content for you guys. I'm like, yes, these guys can finally see this video. I'm finally done with it. I'm eager to get into the comments and even discuss some things or whatever it is. Just communicate with you guys and see you guys, enjoying the video, giving feedback, all that stuff. It really gives me a lot of motivation, man. So I thank you guys for an amazing 2022 as well. You guys don't even know. I'm probably not great with words, with expressing this, but I've tried my best. And then for the last question, we're going to go to Jay. Hey, Weasel, who do you see being the 135-pound champion by the end of 2023? I already answered that in my video where I predict every champion by the end of the year. And also, which big prospects can you see breaking into the top 10 this year? Thanks, keep up the good work. There's various fighters I think they're going to make their way into the top 10. Muhammad Makhachev, Umar Nurmagomedov, unless he is already top 10. Jack Della Maddalena for sure. I am so high in this guy. Some of the best boxing in the whole UFC. The only issue is, it's a division with a lot of good wrestlers and grapplers. His striking style could really open things up, but he really needs to be fixated on defending takedowns and getting back up if he gets taken to the ground. And coming from Perth, Australia, I think training with Robert Whittaker would be the best thing he can do to develop his takedown defense, because Whittaker is one of the best anti-wrestlers in UFC history. I can also potentially see Jailton Almeida making it to the top 10. He's very new to the UFC, but the heavyweight division has always been somewhat lackluster on the lower end of the rankings. Potentially Terrence McKinney can make his way into the top 10. Jasmine Uruguay in the strawweight division, I think it's for sure she's going to make it into the top 10. And Bo Nickel, I think, will make his way into the top 15, not the top 10. If he makes it top 10 this year, that is insane. And that's ultimately the end of the podcast, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to give it a like. Make sure to subscribe as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video.